How else to explain her suicide? I'm not sure about the quality of the psychiatric treatment she got. For example, another drug that she mentions being prescribed for her is ketamine. And Donald Trump appears to be in trouble. And we're going to come back to a point about whether he is mentioned or not in this book. Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant doctor and psychiatrist based in private practice in Harley Street in London in the United Kingdom. I want to talk today about this explosive memoir, Nobody's Girl, published and written by Virginia Giuffre. Actually, not entirely written by her, as a story as told to Amy Wallace, who you could describe as the ghostwriter. So this book has received a lot of attention, and you could say that it's directly responsible for some major news events that have occurred recently, including the fact that Andrew has been stripped of his various titles and as a result has been completely laid low, as it were, and destroyed by the publication of this book and the allegations that are in this book. Also, there's been a recent massive release of a lot of files around the Epstein case, and Donald Trump appears to be in trouble. And we're going to come back to a point about whether he is mentioned or not in this book. But what I want to focus on is a psychological analysis of what's really going on here. The book has had a lot of attention and has already caused a lot of things to happen in the world. It's been in itself a news event, and it's caused a lot of news events. But I wonder how many people have actually read the book. I've just read it from cover to cover. And also I wonder whether the people who've read it have been trained in psychiatry and psychology and cannot see something which I'd like to disclose in this video, which is that I think this book is about a lot more than what people think it's about. I also believe there's a sense in which actually the darkest secret of Virginia Giuffre has been left unsaid, and I'm going to try and say it later on in this video. Basically, one of the key questions is, what is this book really about? You could say, which is what the main news media and social media seem to be saying, it's revealing that there's some really bad people in the world, like Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, amongst other people. And many people are named, whose names have not cropped up in the press, who were directly involved in the sex trafficking and the sexual abuse of underage girls, as alleged in this book. However, what the book is probably really about is how abuse hides in plain sight. And actually, the issue isn't that there are many, and there are many, very, very disturbed and deeply evil people in the world, sexual predators, who are very dangerous. But more, I think, what this book is about is all the people around those people who see something going on and do nothing about it or are a bit blind to it. And I believe the book itself, actually, could be a form of final abuse of Virginia Giuffre, and that the collaborators who worked on it with her actually may have been complicit in a kind of abuse of her. How else to explain her suicide? So I want to focus on that aspect. I find it intriguing that all people are kind of saying is that our thoughts are with the victims. How many people have been thinking hard about the fact or discussed the fact that this woman killed herself? This poor woman killed herself. And one of the questions is, given that happened around the time of the finalizing of the publishing of the book was published a few months after her death, to what extent is the publication of the book actually implicated in her suicide? And I'm going to mount an argument that there may well be a link between the two things. Now, one of the issues is that many people would say that actually she killed herself because of all the trauma she'd experienced, and the trauma is gone into in great explicit and terrible detail. It's a very difficult read, this book, and that to some extent, and this is an easy popular psychological explanation, her suicide arises out of all the trauma that she'd experienced many years earlier. However, there's a problem with that argument, given the book details her own passion for the fight against sexual abusers and the fight against the system that often collaborates with them. And the book, therefore, is a vindication of many years of hard work to produce this book. The book took many years of hard work. Therefore, you would have thought the publication of the book, or just a few months before the publication of the book, would have been a time of great optimism for this young woman. It would have been a time where she'd be thinking she's going to be finally vindicated and finally get her story out there. Another point that is made repeatedly in the book is that she herself had been exploited many times by other journalists, and as a result, her story was misrepresented. Given that she felt very badly about how misrepresented a story had been before, and this was a final clearing of the air, it is odd that she should want to kill herself around the time of the publication of the book. There's another argument, of course, and I think there's an element of deep truth to this, that the woman, like many people, and this is one of the reasons I want to make this video, had experienced maybe very poor psychiatric treatment in terms of the standard for treatment. Clearly, she'd been very traumatized by what had gone on before, and her memories of it, traumatic memories, which is a common symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, and she says in the book she was diagnosed with this. And one common symptom of this disorder is intrusive memories that suddenly come out of the blue and are very disturbing past events. And it looks like she was really struggling with this particular symptom for a long, extended period of time, and she documents that in the book. But that raises a problem, which is now writing this book means going back into the past and digging up these memories. And was that process, without adequate psychological help and support, actually complicit and implicit in why she ended up taking her life? Was not adequate care given to Virginia Giuffre? And that, in terms of the process, the psychological process of writing this book, and is that one of the reasons that she killed herself? I'm going to make some other videos about other implications of the book, but I'm focusing on her mental health. And does the book provide some clues as to the mystery? In my view, it's a mystery as to why she killed herself. And again, I come back to the point I want to make again. It's very odd to me that people are focused on the book. They keep saying our thoughts are with the victims. Very little analysis of her suicide and what actually happened and why did it happen. It almost feels a bit like there's a cover-up involved, and that a lot of people surrounding her may be feeling a bit guilty, not least, perhaps, the not very good therapist, or maybe not very good psychiatrist. I know that's an allegation I'm making, but there is some evidence, it would seem to me, as a psychiatrist reading the book, that she did not really get great support or help. So does the book provide a psychological answer to the mystery as to why she killed herself? So again, many people would say, well, she was very traumatized, so she was psychiatrically distorted naturally as a result, and therefore it follows that the suicide may have been a result of that. But my point is the timing of it, around the time of the publication of the book, certainly around the time when the publication is being finalized, seems striking, and I believe I'm going to argue, there is a connection. So I want to read a very striking email. This is on page XVI. They use Roman numerals before the book begins in itself, before the introduction. And this is Amy Wallace, the collaborator, the ghostwriter of the book, writing this. The next day on April the 1st, Virginia sent me and Dinny von Muffling, her longtime publicist, an email stating clearly her desire to publish the book. It read in part, I'm reaching out to discuss an important matter regarding my book, Nobody's Girl. It is my heartfelt wish that this work be published, regardless of my circumstances at the time. This is a very strange email. It is my heartfelt wish that this work be published regardless of my circumstances at the time. What does that mean? What circumstances? To a psychiatrist, this strongly hints that maybe the psychiatrist or the therapist who were around her at the time were kind of like noticing a deterioration in Virginia's mental state, given maybe what had been stirred up by the writing of the book, and were advising her because it says, regardless of my circumstances. Maybe they were advising her that the book was re-traumatizing her and she was becoming perhaps more mentally ill at the time and she should take a break, or maybe delay the publication of the book till she'd recovered mentally. There are many other possible interpretations of regardless of my circumstances, but it is a kind of strange question. The other thing I have to say is that Amy Wallace is publishing only an excerpt of the email. Why has she not published the whole email? The fact that she's saying, Virginia, it's my heartfelt wish that this work be published, suggests that there's some back and forth about it not being published, right? Well, why? Why was there back and forth? What was that back and forth about? I'm going to discuss that in more detail later. Virginia's email goes on, the content of this book is crucial as it aims to shed light on the systemic failures that allow the trafficking of vulnerable individuals across borders. It is imperative that the truth is understood and that the issues surrounding this topic are addressed both for the sake of justice and awareness. Now, this next bit is amazing in my view, and again, why is no one talking about it? In the event of my passing, I would like to ensure that nobody's girl is still released. I believe it has the potential to impact many lives and foster necessary discussions about these grave injustices. I kindly ask for your assistance in making this wish a reality. Thank you for your support, patience, and most importantly, love. Let me read that again. In the event of my passing, I would like to ensure that nobody's girl is still released. This seems to me a direct cry for help or a warning that this woman is considering suicide, in which case Amy Wallace and Denis von Muffling, who received this email, have a responsibility to urgently get this woman some very intensive help, given this is a clear threat or warning of a possible suicide. And did that happen? I don't know whether the woman did kill herself. So there's a kind of warning in this email, and it does seem to me to be linked very strongly to something going on with the book itself. So the other thing that's a bit strange is, I kindly ask for your assistance in making this wish a reality. There's something about this email that's a bit suspicious, that looks a bit like they said to her, you have to write an email that we can then have as a legal document that indicates you want the book published. And if they said that to her, why did they say that to her? That, I know, is a serious allegation I'm making. I'm just saying, as a psychiatrist, this is a very strange email. I'm just exploring some various possibilities. I'm not saying I know for certain what this was about. Anyway, she goes on, Amy Wallace, to say after writing about the email that on April the 5th, Virginia released a statement to People magazine stating publicly for the first time that her husband had abused her and specifically citing the alleged assault on January 9th. And the statement read in part, I was able to fight back against Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, who abused and trafficked me, but I was unable to escape the domestic violence in my marriage until recently. After my husband's latest physical assault, I can no longer stay silent. So another theory as to why she killed herself is that she ended up, in the end, in an abusive, physically abusive relationship with Robbie Giuffre, and that trauma led to her suicide. But there's some other problems with that, which is that there's controversy about this abuse, in that this whole book doesn't mention it, really, except for this bit in the beginning by Amy. And the allegations that arose after her death, particularly from family members and friends who came forward, is that, and this is an allegation, I want to emphasize that this has not been proven in the court of law, that Robbie had been physically abusive to her. And we'll come back to this point of why she seems to end up with abusive people. I'm not blaming her, I'm not victim blaming here. I'm just saying there's a pattern that we need to explore about what's possibly going on. But there's something very strange about the fact that the book doesn't mention, basically, that Robbie was behaving terribly towards her. So, except for this introduction bit from Amy, which obviously would have been written after Virginia died. So I wonder whether Virginia was actually upset that the publishers and Amy were not including the abuse by Robbie. There was a legal tangle here in that Robbie had taken out successfully a restraining order against Virginia, saying that Virginia had to stay away from him, and also had taken out an order which meant she had no access to her children. Again, to a psychiatrist, this is all very strange because it's very unusual for a mother to be denied access to her children. So was there some tangled legal thing going on where Virginia was responsible for breaking the law in some way, or was a threat in some way? I'm not saying she was. I'm just wondering aloud why the authorities would have allowed a husband to take a restraining order. You can't do that without evidence, and some quite serious evidence. So did the publishers back away from what Virginia really wanted, which was also to document maybe the allegations of abuse by her husband? And that's why she was very unhappy about, another reason why she was very unhappy about the publication of the book. The other thing that's very interesting is that Amy Wallace, who was the ghostwriter of the book, had collaborated for an extended period of time with Virginia over the writing of the book, many years, I think. Yet, although Virginia mentions, for example, a female legal expert who was very helpful to her and how supportive she was in her battle against Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, and she mentions a few other psychotherapists, Virginia does in the book, that were supportive, she never mentions that Amy Wallace was supportive or helpful. There is a staggering silence about that. Given the nature of writing a book like this, which is you're trying to get someone who's been terribly abused to speak about their memories, you're not just an ordinary journalist or writer if you're doing that properly. You have to be very supportive in a psychological sense. So you just get a slight hint, given that nothing positive is said about Amy, but lots of positive things has been said about other people's support of Virginia, by Virginia in the book, that their relationship was possibly a bit strained. I don't know. I'm not saying for certain, but I'm saying there's something a bit odd about no mention of how supportive Amy would have had to have been for this book to have come out without traumatizing or re-traumatizing Virginia. Yet lots of mention in the book of other people that she found supportive, particularly one female legal expert that she mentions. And that's quite interesting because that legal expert would have played a similar role to a journalist or a ghostwriter in getting her to recount memories, but in a legal context in that case. And it shows how very important psychological support is at the time of that discourse. Now, she also does mention, Virginia, that she had been previously exploited by other journalists. In particular, she mentions a journalist writing for the Daily Mail who exploited her. And she mentions other cases like that. There is another very interesting example of her being exploited by a lawyer, and other lawyers did in the past, but she ended up with a good legal team, she says, in the end. One lawyer, rather clumsily, as they happen to be in New York, suggests suddenly that they go to Jeffrey Epstein's house and see if there's anyone inside the house that might agree to be a witness in the forthcoming case. Now, you don't need to be a psychiatrist to know that someone suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder does not return to the scene of the crime or the trauma easily. That's got to be done very gradually. She hadn't been back to the house for many years and had run away from Jeffrey Epstein and was very scared of him. So the lawyer seems to have insisted, or Virginia didn't fight back enough, and this is one key point. She does seem to be exploited by people who are very pushy, and she finds it very difficult, for various reasons perhaps, not least to do with the fact that her abuse really started when she was very young, and she alleges she was abused by her father and one of the best friends of her father when she was very young. So maybe she was very psychologically damaged. I don't know, but I'm just suggesting. And as a result, when people are pushy with her, she ends up folding, and as a result ends up being exploited. Those people shouldn't be pushy. I'm not blaming Virginia, but it is interesting that the lawyer managed to get her to go to the house, although she was having a panic attack during that time, and even tried to covertly record, gave Virginia some recording equipment just in case anyone did agree to speak to her through the intercom or allow her into the house. So these are little examples of where people are seemingly supposed to be helping her, but actually in the end up re-traumatizing her or re-abusing her. Did that happen in the writing of this book? One obvious question about Virginia's suicide is, was it a suicide? Because, it seems to be that a lot of people involved in the Epstein case end up dying by suicide. Epstein himself, and Virginia, I'm going to read a bit, is very suspicious about that. There was a head of a model agency who was arrested by French authorities, and before he could face trial while he's in his cell, also hung himself. And now Virginia has killed herself. So there's a conspiracy theory suspicion that a lot of people end up dead, and it's rather convenient in terms of powerful figures, very powerful men. Ex-presidents are mentioned in this book. Billionaires, famous billionaires are mentioned, who have power. And do they just polish people off as a way of dealing with the threat to them? So here's another very interesting bit, given the suicide. When someone on Twitter, this is on page 294, when someone on Twitter speculated that the FBI might kill me to protect the ultra-rich and well-connected, I felt the need to respond. If I died suddenly, I tweeted, no one should believe that it was an accident. I'm making it publicly known there is no way, shape or form am I suicidal. I typed hastily but resolutely, making several spelling and grammatical errors that I've corrected here. I have made this known to my therapist and my GP. If something happens to me, for the sake of my family, do not let this go away and help me to protect them. Too many evil people want to see me quieted. So she's saying that if it turns out that actually there's an allegation she did kill herself, she didn't. That's what she's saying. So let's talk a bit about that suspicion that maybe there's something else that happened. She says on page 299, talking about Epstein's death, as the details came out, nearly everything about Epstein's death seemed fishy. Even the Attorney General William Barr would acknowledge he initially had suspicions that Epstein had been murdered. Instead, he concluded otherwise, that Epstein's death was a result of a perfect storm of screw-ups. There was the fact that Epstein had tried to harm himself before, but then been taken off suicide watch. While he'd had a cellmate at some point on the night of his death, he did not have one. 2 prison guards who sat at a desk just 15 feet from Epstein's cell were supposed to check on him every half hour, from 10:30 p.m. to 6:30 a.m. Instead, they napped and browsed the internet, then falsified the logs to say they'd completed their rounds. Security cameras that could have captured Epstein's self-harming behaviour, or if conspiracy theorists are to be believed the actions of whoever murdered him, were not functioning. Other cameras that were working showed that no one had entered the area where Epstein was housed on the night he died, so that seemed to rule out the possibility of an assassin sneaking in. But then his brother hired a forensic pathologist to examine the official autopsy report. That expert concluded that the broken bones and cartilage in Epstein's neck pointed to homicide. So that's a very intelligent analysis of why something suspicious may have happened over Epstein's suicide. And she's kind of making this point, be suspicious about my suicide if it turns out to be that way. And she's saying this before the suicide. There's something else she says that's very interesting down on page 300 at the bottom. I'll tell you one thing, though. While I've read that Epstein was buried in an unmarked grave not far from his parents in Palm Beach, Florida, I don't believe that at all. Epstein had repeatedly told me exactly what would happen when he died. His body would be placed in some sort of a cryogenic chamber to be preserved until technology advanced far enough to bring him back to life. That's what he'd always bragged to me, with that satisfied smirk on his face. I know it sounds far-fetched, but I wouldn't bet against the notion that he somehow got his way on this. So that's an extraordinary idea. But going back to the suicide, Virginia's suicide, if she was paranoid enough to believe that Jeffrey could actually come back from the dead, as it were, and he was worth over $500 million, she would be very worried that actually the publication of this book could actually put her life in danger. And maybe that's one reason why she could have felt a bit hopeless. But again, she would have voiced, I would have thought, those anxieties and fears, and the people around her involved in publishing this book should have provided more care or support if actually the publication of the book made her feel more vulnerable to actually being attacked herself. And she does describe several incidents where cars drive up to her house with strange men in it, and she herself gets a gun, by the way, I think more than one gun, to protect herself. She was very worried she's going to get polished off as a result of the allegations in the book. So is that actually what happened? Having said that, to be fair, because I believe in properly debating the evidence, she did make some quite serious suicide attempts. So she says on page 348 at the bottom, alarmingly, I see now I wasn't afraid anymore. Instead, I just felt hollowed out. So when my trauma tricked my brain into telling me lies, I listened. It would be better for everyone if you weren't here, my brain said. You bring nothing but stress and worry into your husband and children's lives. Why should they suffer because Jeffrey and Ghislaine caused you pain? You have let your family down. they deserve better. They will be happier without you. My trauma took aim at my very existence. Aren't you exhausted? Unconsciousness would be a relief. Robbie and the kids are safe at home, so none of them will find you. It won't hurt a bit. The pills are on the bedside table. It will be easy. You can just quietly slip away. The way that is written is very interesting from a psychiatrist's standpoint. You bring nothing but stress and worry. So that could be a thought, but I have to say, I'm not saying this is the case, it does feel a bit like she's describing a voice speaking to her. I'm not saying that we can say that with any certainty, but there's something about the vividness of that account that again captures some really quite serious psychological disturbance going on here. Anyway, she goes, I believed my brain, so I reached for the painkillers that I had smuggled into the hospital, and I swallowed as many as I could. Later, they'd estimate 240 pills. That is a very serious suicide attempt. That sheer number of pills shows a certain relentlessness and drive and motivation. Before I passed out, I'm told that I was revived with Narcan, the opioid overdose treatment. My fragile self-worth had imploded. All that remained were the shards of me. Oh, the look on Robbie's face when they told him. He couldn't bear the thought of me disappearing, and he wanted to strangle me for trying to disappear. What were you thinking, Jenna? He demanded. Now, this is on page 349, which is really right towards near the end of the book. She's kind of portraying Robbie in this book, as currently written, as being a very concerned husband, which is sort of kind of flies in the face of the allegations she's meant to have made around the same time that he'd been physically abusing her for a long time, none of which those allegations end up in this book. So there's something very contradictory about what's going on here. Another point, she was given Narcan, which meant that the pills that she took were basically, and she does say this elsewhere, oxycodone or an opioid of some kind. And she'd had quite a serious neck injury and was on quite heavy pain medication. And it looks like she may have become dependent on it. She did have a history of drug dependency. She's clear and very honest and undefensive about that in the book. She basically got addicted to Xanax, also took cannabis and ecstasy and cocaine. So that was back in the dark days when she was hanging out with Epstein's crew, and she certainly appeared to got off all those things. But she was clearly someone who struggled a bit, I would argue, from reading between the lines, with dependency on substances. So again, I'm not sure about the quality of the psychiatric treatment she got. For example, another drug that she mentions being prescribed for her is ketamine. So if the doctors were prescribing oxycodone and ketamine, I do wonder whether she had enough psychiatric support, because she would have needed it rather than just be given those quite dangerous drugs and being left to her own devices. There's some real questions about suicide and the reason why she may have killed herself, and if she actually did kill herself. One of the questions is, given how traumatized she clearly had been by dreadful events that clearly did occur, because they're corroborated and are in court cases, and Ghislaine Maxwell was found guilty. Interestingly, the lawyers didn't call Virginia Giuffre to give evidence at the Ghislaine Maxwell case. And that's interesting as to why that was. Were they concerned? I don't know the answer, I'm just speculating here. Were they concerned about her mental fragility? And if so, if they were concerned about her mental fragility and felt they had enough evidence, given she was surely one of the main witnesses and they didn't use her, if they were concerned enough about her mental fragility not to use her in a court case, should the publishers of this book been a bit concerned about her mental fragility and taken a bit more care over the support that she may have needed to give this testimony? I am not saying that was the reason why the lawyers didn't use her. There may have been other reasons why they didn't use her, but it is an interesting question. Another example of poor therapy that I think she got, which may have contributed to her problems, is one of the therapists, and clearly the therapist was struggling with how to help her with these terrible intrusive memories, and I think they were a bit out of their depth, frankly. It takes a well-trained specialist to handle this kind of PTSD, given the extraordinary experiences this poor woman had had. One of the therapists said something really quite astonishing, and it seems to come out of, like, a circus or a fairground type psychic. She said, write all the stuff down in various books and pages, and then burn them. What? A therapist gave this advice? and that's the way to get rid of the memories. That's extraordinary. Like really bad advice, I think. And so, is it the case that she was not helped properly with proper psychiatric help? Again, given there were several big payouts, there was a very big payout. The headline of the Daily Mail was 12 million, I think, dollars or pounds from Andrew to her as one of the payouts. Several $100,000 dollars, I think, were paid out by Ghislaine Maxwell and by Jeffrey Epstein. And also, the book itself would have been earning money. So this was a woman who had money, and there's a question I want to raise about where's all this money going following her death. Why could she not afford very good psychiatric help? Because clearly it sounds like the psychological help she got was not very good. So one of the questions as to whether the book's re-traumatized her is whether the book is really an account of what she wanted to say, given it's written by a ghostwriter. Some of it, undoubtedly, will be what Virginia wanted to say, but how much of it is actually what she wanted to say? And how much of it was she being bullied or abused, in a sense, again, forced by publishers to give an account that Virginia, in the end, was not that happy with? In which case, does that explain, to some extent, the suicide? Was there a re-traumatizing? Oddly enough, is the book a kind of re-abusing of this poor woman? A couple of examples of the way the book is written that suggests that Virginia would not be entirely on board with exactly that. Virginia left school in the 9th grade, didn't graduate, never went to university, didn't graduate from high school, and spent a lot of a childhood really quite traumatized, experienced abuse from her parents and neglect, so wouldn't have been able really to focus very well at school. And yet, there's some rather strange allusions. Several very big words are used in this book. I mean, symbiosis is used. I wouldn't have come across symbiosis as a word until I did A-level biology. So would Virginia really have used words like that? There's an allusion to Lord of the Flies, which is a book, a famous book, which people don't read Lord of the Flies, I think by William Golding. It's not unlike an airport fiction book. I'm not casting aspersions on Virginia's educational level, but to make a literary allusion like that was a bit strange, I thought. It felt more like the kind of thing a writer, Amy, would say rather than Virginia. There's some other allusions. Virginia does say in the book that she read Black Beauty, and she does like animals. Black Beauty is a famous children's book, and that I could believe that she would have read. I just find it a little bit odd, the Lord of the Flies allusion, and a few other literary expressions which seem to come more from an experienced writer than really from Virginia, and therefore you just get a strong feeling that Amy's voice is coming out here, maybe a bit more than Virginia's. One of the patterns that occurs in the book is that she seems to move, and I'm not blaming her for this, in a desperate way to escape one abuser and then lands in the lap of another, almost literally. So the book opens with a dreadful account of her being almost like homeless on the streets when she was very young, and a man stops her car and offers her a lift, and then she's brutally raped in the back of a van by this man, and then again she's thrown out on the streets again in the same incident, and then another man stops, but this man's driving a flash car, and she gets into that and offers her a lift, and she gets into that car. That man turns out to be an abuser who does actually face the justice system in the end. But you see a pattern of running away from one abuser into the arms of another, and there's a kind of impulsivity, a certain desperation, which I think we can all understand, and given that she was neglected by her parents and didn't really have a supportive family home, there was nowhere to run to. So she had a tendency to run in impulsively into what she thought was a rescuer each time, but turns out to be an abuser. And there's that repeated pattern. I mean, Virginia Giuffre, who she ends up marrying and then alleged before her suicide, physically abused her, made allegations of domestic violence, extensive domestic violence. She met him while she was attending a massage school in Thailand. This was paid for by Jeffrey Epstein. Within 8 to 10 days, I think, of meeting him, they get married in a temple, in a Buddhist temple. That seems a little bit impulsive, to say the least. Given her experience of men, should have led her to be a bit cautious, I would have thought, about the dark side of many men, you'd have thought getting married after just knowing someone for 10 days seems a bit impulsive. There's another incident, and to be fair to Virginia, she does write very openly and undefensively, or at least as told the story to Amy Wallace, about her own frailties. She and Robbie are still in holiday in Thailand. I think they're married now, and they invite a Canadian into their camp, or into their tent to sort of have a party. And then the Canadian, they fall asleep. They're very drunk, and they fall asleep. And then the Canadian, when they wake up the next morning, they discover the Canadian has robbed them of basically all their money, and they fall into another crisis of how to get back to Australia. A couple of other examples. She's in Morocco with Epstein, goes wandering out on the streets, I think in the night, meets some very, very poor children, takes out her wallet, and impulsively gives them $2,000. I mean, very dangerous in the middle of nowhere to open your wallet and flash the cash like that. She realizes afterwards that that was an impulsive and dangerous act. But there's a repeated pattern of this kind of impulsivity. She finally lands one great job at a pet shop. She loves animals. She has her heart set on buying a particular bird that's for sale in the pet shop. As she just gets to the right amount of money, the owner unfortunately sells the bird to someone else. She's upset by this and actually leaves that job in a peak of being upset. Goes to another pet shop, and that pet shop doesn't last very long because the pet shop closes and she's unemployed again. So you see a pattern of escaping into trouble, and that's not necessarily her fault, but she is abused a lot, and everywhere she turns to, she ends up being abused further. Another example of a tension between her and the writer, Amy Wallace, in interviews after the book has been published, has talked about that infamous picture with Andrew, where Andrew's got his arm around Virginia's waist. And she says, this picture, she says that her account, Amy Wallace's account, is that Virginia was very excited to meet a prince. And there's a slight hint she thought the prince might rescue her. Amy talks about how Virginia loved the story Cinderella. I think there's a line in the song, "Someday my prince will come." And that explains the photograph, in that Virginia carried around instant cameras, not instant cameras, cameras where you could develop the film, proper film cameras, but they were like one use only. She always carried these around, and she gave the camera to Jeffrey Epstein to have the picture taken. So Amy's account is that she was excited to meet the prince, and we're all thinking, well, you every single man you've been introduced to by Jeffrey Epstein is ended up abusing you, and you're being trafficked all the time, and Epstein only uses you. Why did you think Andrew would be any different? Virginia's account is not that she was excited to meet the prince so much, is that she thought Prince Andrew was very famous. And she said to herself, it would be silly not to have a photograph of me with this very famous man. So she hands the camera to Jeffrey Epstein. So two quite different accounts, right, of what was really going on there. If Amy's account is to be believed, that she almost wanted to meet the prince and she thought she'd be rescued by the prince, is yet another example of this thing of fleeing from one abuser into another. So basically, the book is really about abuse occurs. They're dangerous and evil people. They're predators. They're quite powerful sometimes, and they can bend the justice system to their will. But the book is also about something else. Abuse occurs in plain sight, and we're all sometimes complicit because we're turning the other way, looking the other way. And that's a more uncomfortable story that I think the media's not picked up on. But I think it's a very important story that people are complicit. Okay, they're not truly evil. They're just a lot of people around Epstein and Maxwell were actually complicit. And there's a very poignant photograph in the book that actually was widely distributed of a famous celebrity party with Naomi Campbell, and Virginia is in the picture. And interestingly, here it is, this picture here. You can see Virginia there. She looks like a child, and she makes the point very intelligently. And it's interesting how you've got this child at this sort of adult party, and no one seems to think there's something a bit strange about all these young children, basically, that were hanging around Maxwell and Epstein and going to these glitzy parties. How come all these people at these glitzy parties, thousands of people basically, saw this thing in plain sight and did nothing? And that is the more disturbing and actually, I think, more relevant message. But is the book itself an example of that pattern repeating itself? In that, did the people who produced this book use Virginia to their own ends? Who's earning all the money? Where's the money going? Is the final content of this book really what Virginia wanted? In which case, why did she kill herself around the time of finalizing the content? She should have been pleased. Virginia says, there are many famous men I have not mentioned. I have not named because I'm worried that they for various reasons. But she says quite clearly, there are many famous men I've not mentioned. The recent release of the files implicates, and there's a controversy and a battle raging back and forth about whether Virginia met Donald Trump and whether, in fact, that was one of the people that did actually assault her. That's an allegation. That's not actually mentioned in this book, that she did meet Donald Trump, but it was right back at the beginning when she was working at his Florida resort as a locker room attendant. And there's no evidence from this book in terms of what she says that Donald Trump was anything other than nice to her. However, is it the case that she really wanted to mention people and the publisher told her to take those names out because it's going to cause too much legal trouble? Trump is famous for suing people all the time. I'm not saying this is what happened. I'm just speculating about why this woman killed herself around the time the content of this book is finalized. So is that one possibility, that she wanted names to be in here that were not in her, and she felt very, very upset about that and felt abused and exploited by the people who produced the book? So abuse happens in plain sight. Is the book an example of a form of abuse happening in plain sight? One final point I want to make. The picture on the front of the book is a faded picture. It's done on purpose. It's a faded picture of Virginia, like she's fading out. But she quite clearly in the book describes a great fighting spirit, that she wanted to be known and she wanted, as a victim, to help other victims. So it's an assertive account in the book of her story. This book is published after she kills herself, and there's a very strange picture on the front with her like fading away or fading out. Why have they done that? Very strange. So my question is this book really something that helped Virginia? In which case, why did she kill herself around the time of its finalizing the publication? Or was this something actually that was not helpful, and she has a pattern of moving from one unhelpful thing to another, where she hopes the other thing will be helpful, but is not helpful? So, is abuse hiding in plain sight yet again? Thank you very much.